Chapter 8 Daydreams. In the days that followed, Kenneth and I did grow closer. I felt something magical being born between us because of the artistic work he was creating with me as his muse. The way he included me in his creative thinking made me feel as if I was so important to that vision that I gradually began to believe it, to feel it as if I were really an essential part of his work. And then one day after I finished chipping away the block where Kenneth told me to chip, I stepped back. As I gazed at the partially carved marble, I began to see it take form. It was just as he said. The sculpture was emerging. Kenneth was using his talent, his vision to bring it out, and because I'd grown closer to him, I could share somewhat of that vision. It was as if I had been staring and staring at the same scene, and suddenly I saw the colors, the shapes, the movement I'd been told were always there, but until now I'd never been able to see. He'd warned me that once we got into this, he would eat, sleep, and drink it. He reminded me of a deeply religious person who had taken a vow and dedicated his life to a single prayer. I was always the first to become hungry and asked if we could break for lunch. Usually he never heard me, and the first time I spoke, he would be looking at me, but it was as if he had already transcended into a world where he was living and breathing on another plane. He was in the world of his creation, traveling over the highway of his own imagination, and I was afraid that he would leave me somewhat far behind. "Kenneth, my stomach is growling," I moaned. "What?" "I've been pleading for the last half hour. Aren't you hungry?" I cried. I was still basically in the same position he had originally placed me. It seemed that whatever he was doing was never good enough to please him. He would rip off pages and crumble them up from frustration and start anew. Pacing, studying, coming up to me, adjusting my shoulders or my head, changing a strand of hair, finding something to do with the most minute detail of my being before making a new attempt to satisfy his artistic appetite. Meanwhile, my lowly earthly appetite whined and groaned. "Oh yes, right, it's lunch already. It seems like we just started." "We've been at it for nearly 3 hours, Kenneth. Even to a fanatic like you, that's some more than just starting, isn't it?" I asked. He laughed and threw up his hands. "Sorry. Okay, go fix some lunch. I'll be right there," he promised. "I'm going to call you Kenneth." "I'm not going to call you Kenneth. This time I'm going to start eating without you if you don't come," I warned. "A model's not supposed to nag the artist," he decreed. "She has to remain subtle and discreet, very unobtrusive, or the artist will lose the vision and have to start all over again," he threatened. "That's blackmail," I told him and pulled up my sweatshirt. "No, it's basic artistic survival," he replied. I paused before leaving the studio and looked at him sharply. It caught his attention. "What?" he asked. "You're not above taking advantage of your art to escape from things," I accused. He started to grimace and then turned it into a smile. "Looks like the model is beginning to develop some vision herself," he said, nodding. "Go make lunch. I'll be right in. That's an artistic promise." I laughed and hurried out. Whenever he smiled at me and spoke warmly to me, it changed my face of the world. Every day he had become more and more interesting and a little more exciting for me. Kenneth and I had our heart-to-heart discussion, confessing more to each other, and finally being honest with each other. It was as if a barrier had crumbled between us. Realizing that Kenneth could not be my father changed everything. Something different, some new feeling was emerging from the deepest places in my secret put-away heart. Even when I was away from him, home from work, helping Aunt Sarah in the kitchen, playing with May, I couldn't stop thinking of Kenneth. I would go over things that he had said to me that day, and the way he looked at me, and it all took a new meaning. I even imagined that the long, slow looks he'd given me while we were working were looks not of an artist in love with his art, but of a man in love with his model. Carrie lost patience with me a number of times because I wasn't listening or paying attention to him. I resembled someone going in and out of a coma, drifting, walking about with a soft grin on my face, nodding at sounds, but never really hearing anything but the whispering voices emerging from my own tingling heart. Through the fog of it all, I knew that I was disappointing Carrie, letting him down, but I just couldn't help wanting something more from Kenneth, something I was afraid Carrie could never give me. No matter how I tried, I couldn't stop fantasizing about Kenneth and that he was falling in love with me. In the library, I read stories about famous artists who developed passionate affairs with their models, affairs of love that drove them mad with desire. Age didn't matter when it came to such a strong emotion. It would be the same between Kenneth and me, I thought. After all, we had so much in common, and that came from his own lips. He said that we were both like orphans, rejecting the rejected by family. Most important, he had been in love with Mommy, and now he surely saw something of her in me, enough of her to stir his suffering heart. It went deeper, I told myself. And he not only saw Mommy in me, but something more. He had said that too. He told me that I was twice the woman. Could that mean he cared for me twice as much as he cared for Mommy? Perhaps because these new feelings, as well as my growing understanding of artistic process, I was even more anxious to go to Kenneth's studio each day. I even offered to work overtime and no pay, and come Sunday as well as Saturday if he wanted. We'll see, he said. An artist can't rush things, can't overdo them either. I'm not complaining, you understand. I would never complain about it. But the work is very intense, exhausting. When you leave here, I usually crash. And you don't eat supper I prepared for you, right? He shrugged. I know you don't, because when I return the next day, I can see the food is still there. I should stay longer and eat dinner with you, I suggested finally. Don't they expect you home to help? If I don't eat there, I don't have to earn my keep, I told him. We'll see, he said, always the cautious one. Twice during the week, however, I got him to permit me to serve him dinner and eat with him. I pretended that this was our house, and Kenneth and I had long discussions over the meal I'd so lovingly prepared. One night our discussion turned to family, and as always our words became heated. I'm not looking for any confrontations with Jacob Logan, he said, not now. He wouldn't dare cause any trouble. I would just leave, that's all. When Kenneth didn't say anything, I added, I could just move in here and sleep in your other bedroom. Are you kidding? Jacob would set the authorities on me and get me arrested for corrupting the morals of a minor, he said. I'm not a minor, I snapped. He started to smile, but stopped when he saw how lobster red with indignation my face had become. In the eyes of the law, you most certainly are a minor. You're miles above an average girl your age, I admit, he added to soften the tension between us. But we have to be careful, Melanie. Many people would not fully understand or appreciate what we're doing here. I haven't told anyone anything, I said. Not even Carrie, he asked, his eyes narrow with suspicion. Not even Carrie. I realize that he's not mature enough yet to understand what we're doing, I replied, throwing my hair back and gazing at him with a defiant air that brought a small but intriguing smile to his face. I was a little sad, though, that what I'd said was true. Carrie wouldn't understand. He was too much like Uncle Jacob. Kenneth shook his head and laughed lightly, the specks in his brown eyes brightening. You've got spirit, Melanie. I'm really lucky to have found you, he said. I thought my heart would explode with joy. Every night afterward, I went to sleep with his words on my lips. I really am lucky I found you. And I you, dearest Kenneth. I hugged my pillow and dreamed of the day that he would come to me and say, forget society. Forget what these busybodies would say. You and I will make a great art together and should live together forever. I can't sleep without saying your name over and over again until it becomes a song in my heart. Melody, melody. Was I a lovesick schoolgirl I had warned May that she could become? Or was I really mature enough in my heart and spirit to attract romantic interest from an older man? A handsome and interesting older man. Carrie misunderstood my daydreaming and deep thoughts and grew impatient with me often during our walks after dinner. It wasn't until I'd lost all my feelings for him, as he accused, just that being with Kenneth made me realize the limitations of my relationship with Carrie. For as much as Carrie was my confidant, my only true friend here in the Cape, he just would never understand the thoughts and yearnings I discovered growing within myself as I helped Kenneth create his most prized work of art, nor would he understand the role I played in its creation. I feared that Uncle Jacob had been too much of an influence on Carrie, and no matter how he fought it, Carrie would always be his father's son. You're just being polite, spending time with me. Is that it? He accused one night when we walked along the surf. Pardon me? I asked, startled by his tone and sudden outburst. I talk and you nod, but you hardly say anything to me unless I pull it out of you, like pulling a fish out of a line that got tangled in a sunken barge. And when you kiss me, it's a quick, with your eyes slammed closed, and then you rush off to bed you're just different, he finally stammered, unable to complete the thought. But I knew all right. Carrie was accusing me of being just like Laura. I'm not, I said defensively, though I knew in my heart he was partially right. I wasn't like Laura, oh no. I wasn't as saintly and beloved as his sister, but I was different, changing before his very eyes. Yes, you are. It's because of what happened that night on the beach, isn't it? You think I tried to go too far too fast. Carrie, that's ridiculous, I insisted. No, it isn't. I know girls can be like that. They'll sulk and pretend that you don't exist until you come pleading and begging for a kind word and some attention. I don't know why they all call you the weaker sex, he said bitterly. We're the ones who act like clowns and lose our self-respect just to favor or a kiss. Men are the powerless ones, he concluded. That is so untrue, Carrie Logan, I said, spinning on him, my hands on my hips. Men break hearts of women much more than women break the hearts of men. Men are usually the unfaithful ones. They make all sorts of promises that they're supposed to last forever and ever, and they buy expensive presents to convince us of their love, and then, after a while, they go looking for love with someone else. Carrie's eyes widened. I wouldn't, he said. And that's not just an empty promise. I thought you knew me, he said sadly. I thought I knew you too. I guess we're both just fooling ourselves. He marched off, leaving me standing alone on the beach. Carrie, I'm tired, he called back without turning. I've got to get up early tomorrow. I watched him march back to the house, his fist balled with rage. I shook my head in pity. He's been through a lot, I told myself, but he's still a boy compared to Kenneth. In time, he'll be a much stronger person, but it's not my destiny to wait. Is it? I asked the stars. They blinked, but none answered. Yet I felt sure that even if Carrie were right and I had changed, it wasn't wrong for me to change. It simply meant I was growing up. Later that evening, Aunt Sarah called me to the telephone. It was Alice Morgan, my best friend in Sewell. She was excited because her mother had finally given in and said she could make the trip to Providencetown to visit me. "I can leave the day after tomorrow," she exclaimed. "Is that all right?" "Oh, Alice," I said, and thought for a moment. What would I do with her now? How could I bring her along with me to Kenneth's studio? What was happening there had to be kept private for a number of reasons, not the least of which was growing feelings were developing for each other. Alice was always the immature one, even though she was one of the brightest students in school. Her family was one of the richest in Seawall, but she never had a boyfriend. She was much too interested in books and studying to be bothered with clothes and makeup, which seemed to be the only things boys our age noticed. Despite our differences, she was a faithful friend. I hated hurting her. "What's wrong, Melanie? I thought you would be happy about it. We're finally going to see each other after all this time apart." "I know, it's just that..." "Just that what?" "Just that I've taken a job and I won't have time to properly entertain you. You have to spend hours and hours alone. I couldn't leave you alone at this house. My Uncle Jacob would make you miserable and my Aunt Sarah would drive you crazy. It wouldn't be much of a holiday for you." "What about Carrie?" she asked timidly. Was that her real motive for wanting to come? "Oh, he works long hours too, Alice. He's never around." "I see," she said, her voice a little drifted away. It brought tears to my eyes when I imagined her in her room. "What kind of job do you have?" "I work with a local artist," I said. "Sometimes he uses me to model for his pictures." "Really? A model?" "Just simple things," I said quickly, like a girl walking on the beach or walking the dog to the dunes. "But I have to do a lot more. I'm there from early in the morning till dinner and sometimes later, so you see why it wouldn't be fun." "Oh. Maybe before summer's over I'll have a break and you can come. I'll stay in touch and call you as soon as I know when I can get some time off, okay?" "Okay," she said. After I cradled the receiver, I felt awful. There wasn't anything Alice wouldn't have done for me if I had asked her. And when I was desperate, she was ready to give me money, have me move into her house, anything. Carrie was right, I thought. I was becoming a different person. But perhaps when you become mature, you also leave a part of yourself behind with the little girl in you. Becoming an adult seemed to mean becoming a little more selfish in different ways. I promised myself I would put aside a few days for Alice before the summer ended. Once the sculpture was almost finished, Kenneth was sure to need me less, and then I could call Alice and have her come for a visit, I thought. It eased my troubled conscience and helped me put her voice and probable tears out of my mind for some time being. I couldn't dwell on it anyway. I was too busy. Kenneth had me work half a day the following Saturday. When Carrie heard, he was full of questions. He came to my door and knocked and started asking, "Why does Kenneth need you on Saturday? What does he want you to do?" "Same things I do all week, Carrie," I said. I still hadn't mentioned my modeling, and now I probably never would. "Does he take time off?" "It's only for half the day, and he takes off Sundays. When he gets into a project, he becomes totally involved and absorbed by it." "Sounds like he has something else to do with his life." "Sounds like he has nothing to do with his life," he muttered. "Did he mention that boat again?" "No, not yet." Carrie smirked. "Thought so. Everyone's so full of seaweed," he remarked. "Kenneth doesn't say anything that he doesn't mean, Carrie Logan. He'll bring it up soon, I'm sure." Carrie raised his eyebrows. "How come you're so sure of what he says is all of a sudden?" "I just am," I said. He nodded and smirked again and went to his workshop. After breakfast on Saturday morning, Uncle Jacob had the nerve to ask me if my working on the weekend meant Kenneth was paying me time and a half. Yes, he is, I said. Good, don't forget to put half of the overtime in the pot, he ordered. I'm sure if I did forget, you'd be the first to remind me, I said brazenly, knowing I was sure I'd get a lecture. You're not old enough to know responsibility and obligations, he replied. Your mother never had an inkling of what those words meant, and that's because everyone spoiled her. Spare the rod and you spoil the child, he said. I'm not a child, I fired back, but he didn't retreat an inch. Kids today don't grow up as fast as we grew up. They're given way too much and don't have to give back in return. It's getting harder and harder for me to find anyone under 40 who wants to do a day's work. They all think it's just going to come to them, he declared. Yes, I said dryly, I'm living proof of a spoiled person. He blinked and twisted his lips and shoved his pipe into his mouth, grumbling to himself. I recall how Kenneth had called him a moral horse's ass. It brought a smile to my lips. What's so funny? He demanded. What? Oh, nothing, I said, and hurried out, praying harder for the next day when Kenneth would turn to me and say, come live with me and be my love. He was already waiting for me. I hadn't heard him drive up, but it cheered my heart to see him there early. He was just as anxious to be with me as I was to be with him, I thought. I got into the Jeep. We sped off, and I saw there was something different in Kenneth's mind. Some new excitement painted itself on his beautiful face. What are we going to do today? We're moving ahead, he said. I've completed the first stage. Now I want to get into the meat of it. He glanced at me. Neptune's daughter is coming up higher and revealing more of herself in the emergings out of the sea. She's falling out of the female form. I knew what he meant, and it filled me with so much excitement I could barely breathe. I sat back, my heart thumping, the wind blowing my hair. Was I ready? Yes, I thought, I was ready. Almost overnight I'd grown up, and I had already shed my innocence, and I wanted to share myself with Kenneth. Ulysses barked because I had been ignoring him. I laughed and gave him a quick hug as we drove onto the dune road in Kenneth's studio. The studio looked different to me this morning, perhaps because I knew what was about to occur. It seemed darker, the shades drawn lower in the windows. As soon as we stepped through the door, Kenneth did something that he'd never done before. He locked the door behind us, and his eyes shifted guiltily away when he saw my surprise. I'm too far into this to bear even the smallest interruptions, he exclaimed. Since we had never been interrupted before, I didn't think much of his reason, but I smiled and nodded anyway. He went to the model of the wave and studied it intently, his hands on his hips and his right hand stroking his beard as he continued to think and envision. Okay, he finally declared, here's what I want. Undress to your waist and take your usual position, and then come up until you're exposed to here, he pointed, drawing an imaginary line just above his stomach. Got it? I nodded. He returned to his easel and waited as I went around the wave and pulled off my sweatshirt. I hesitated a moment, my fingers actually trembling badly. I couldn't get them to undo the fasten on my bra. Finally, it was unfastened, and I slipped the bra down my arms. I'd studied myself often in the mirror in my room, anticipating this moment. Mommy used to say I was a late bloomer, but that when I bloomed, I would bloom fast. I imagined it had been that way with her, and that's why she knew. When I was 14, I barely had anything on my chest. I thought I would never develop the curves and figure Mommy had. And then suddenly, between the ages of 15 and 16, I began to develop quickly, finding the change in my body each succeeding day. I once went to Mommy and cried, pleading to her to give me a doctor. My breasts would never stop growing. She just laughed and told me not to worry. They would stop growing eventually, and in the meantime, I should learn to enjoy all the attention they brought me. I tried to do what Mommy suggested, but it was hard to enjoy yourself when you felt like an alien in your own body. Soon, though, I did gain self-confidence. The boys no longer teased me about my breasts, and instead they would look at them longingly, and they began to try to win my attention. But now I couldn't help thinking of all the beautiful, mature women Kenneth had seen naked. I was terrified that he would gaze at me and think of me as just a teenager and not a young woman. Carrie had been in awe of my body, but was I shapely enough for a man like Kenneth? Would he gaze at me naked before him and think he had made a big mistake in asking me to model for him? What if I was not the budding beauty he envisioned? All the while, I was trying to gather up my courage to calm my trembling limbs. Kenneth was preoccupied with his preparations and never noticed my shyness and fears. Ready, he called. I took a deep breath and crawled through the opening and started up and out of the wave. As I rose, my heart began to pound and my legs picked up trembling that had begun in my fingers, and I held my breath. Keep your eyes open, he ordered. I swallowed and moved another inch or two, still not revealing my breasts. He waited, his drawing pencil in his hand. Come up, he instructed. That's good, good. And there I was before him. He stared a moment. I felt the crimson color in my neck and face. It was as if Kenneth had walked over and run his brush over my skin. After what seemed like an hour, Kenneth nodded. If he noticed, he didn't mention my blushing. Just turn a bit to your right, and then, if you can, pull your shoulders back a little. Lift your chin and concentrate on the ceiling. Don't be too stiff. Relax. I'm trying, I said. I know, easy. That's good, good, good. All right, let's start with the pose first, he said and began. Whenever I shifted my eyes to glance at him to see what sort of expression he had on his face, I saw only the same intense scrutiny I had seen before. There was no look of appreciation and none of disapproval. The total neutrality of his eyes, his lips, and his entire being surprised and then annoyed me. I jerked my shoulders back. Getting tired, he asked, without taking his eyes from his paper. A little. Just a few more minutes and we'll take a short break. I think I have the curve I want and the lift in your head. Yes, this will work. That's it, he said. What about the rest of me? I said sharply. He just nodded and kept working. It amazed me that I had been right when I told Carrie an artist was like a doctor when he looked at a woman. I'd expected more than this impersonal artistic eye. You're perfect, he finally declared, and he stepped back and looked at me. You're just what I wanted, what I needed. Really? There is innocence in you, this freshness in your body that makes the statement, he said. Statement? My statement. Beauty emerging with birth. Oh. Okay, let's do some more, I groaned. But he didn't pay attention. After another 20 minutes or so, he put down his pencil. You can take a rest. I want to map out some of this on the marble. I'm getting this faster than I thought I might be, he declared proudly. Then I'm doing well as your model, I fished. Outstanding. I stood there, still undressed, facing him, waiting for him to look at me differently, to smile differently, to step up to me and take me in his arms and kiss me long and deeply. My naked breast turned into him, waiting. Instead, he went straight to the cold marble block and left me dangling in my own imagination. I didn't bother putting my bra back on. I slipped into my sweatshirt without it, and then I came up beside him, hoping that he still might turn and look at me as the woman instead of the model, an object of love instead of an object of art. If you'd like to get some fresh air, take Ulysses for a walk on the beach, he suggested. I might be a while. Fine, I said sharply, sharper than I intended, but he didn't appear to notice. I don't think he ever even heard me. I started for the door and Ulysses got up quickly so he could follow. Come along, Ulysses. I can always count on your wanting to be with me at least, I said loud enough for Kenneth to hear. What's that? He said after a moment. Nothing, I'll be right back. Take your time, he said, and returned his attention to his precious block of marble. I slammed the door. I slammed the door hard behind me and marched out towards the beach. Ulysses at my side, trotting, his ears flapping. Men, I fumed and planted myself with a hard thump on the hill of sand. Ulysses looked disappointed that I wasn't walking any further, but I wasn't in the mood. Now when he looks at me, I told Ulysses, he looks right through me. He's not even seeing me. He's seeing that vision of his. Ulysses panted, his tongue hanging over his mouth and his eyes wide as if he understood my indignation. I bet when you see a female you like, you see a female, I told him. He sniffed as if in response and plopped down beside me, convinced I wasn't going to move. I stared out at the ocean. Maybe I'm being too sensitive, I thought. Maybe I'm being too selfish. After all, Kenneth has made art his life and decided to include me in it. That's significant. He probably could have chosen any number of pretty girls in town, or maybe imported one. He's very successful, and he could afford a very expensive model if he wanted. Yet he chose me. I was special in his vision. I looked over at the ocean. A lone cloud in the distance seemed to take shape of a heart. A good omen, I thought. I lay back and Ulysses suddenly put his head on my stomach. It made me laugh. I closed my eyes and felt the sun on my face and the warm sand beneath me. It was all so soothing. In minutes I was asleep. I don't know how long I slept, but I woke up to the sound of Ulysses barking. He was up and facing the road that led to and from Kenneth's house. I sat up and turned to see a small purple car with looked like astrological signs painted all over it. White coming bouncing down the sand ruts. The driver tapped out long, loud beeps of the horn and stopped at the front of Kenneth's studio. Who's that? I asked Ulysses. He gazed at me and then ran down the sandhill toward the driver as she emerged from the car. She was wearing a long one-piece green and white dress, the hem actually touching the ground. Even from a distance, I could see long silver earrings dangling from her lobes. Her dark brown hair was down to her shoulder blades. Ulysses, she cried, kneeling to open her arms to hug him. Ulysses was all over her, licking her face and her neck and her hair. Her laughter was carried back to me in the wind. The woman stood up, shaded her eyes with her hand, and gazed toward me. Without knowing who I was, she waved and then turned as Kenneth came strolling out of the house. I watched as she ran to him with the same enthusiasm Ulysses had run to her. He opened his arms in welcome, and she was in his embrace an instant later. They kissed on the lips, and I felt my heart do flip-flops. When she pulled back, her musical laughter trailed up to me. She was looking my way, and he was obviously explaining who I was. She waved again, and then I got up and started toward them, my heart thumping with anticipation, a small fist of fear growing tighter and tighter on my stomach until I felt as if it would burn right through my skin. "Melanie," Kenneth said as I approached, "I'd like you to meet Holly Brooks." "Hi, Melanie," she exclaimed, her eyes wide with excitement. She wore a purple-tinted lipstick that matched the color of the car. When she extended her hand to shake mine, the half-dozen silver copper bracelets on her arm bunched up at the wrist, and on each finger she wore a ring, completely, simply silver embossed with shapes, two looking like some sort of polished stone. She was a small woman, made to look smaller in her oversized broomstick dress. She looked as if she were swimming in it, yet she had the material shifted. I could see that she was braless, her breast pressing up against the thin cotton. She wore a thin collar around her neck with tiny multicolored stones embedded in the material. There was something very bright and airy about her smile. Her eyes were filled with happy light, making them look more hazel than dark brown. She had a small nose and soft cheeks that dimpled the roundness of her face, and her mouth was small enough too. And her lipstick looked pretty, not garish. There were the tiniest freckles on her face. "Hi," I said and offered my hand. She seized it and shook it firmly. "When's your birthday?" she asked me quickly. "June 12th, I said, looking at Kenneth. He wore a deep smile and nodded slightly. "A Gemini," she declared. "I knew it." "Holly's an astrologer," Kenneth explained, "as well as an artist." "Oh, Aunt Sarah believes in that." "Really? Well, your aunt's a smart lady." "Please," Kenneth said, "spare us the hoodoo voodoo for a while." "Oh, Kenny," she said, "you know I've come to see you only when the right astrological time, and you know that we're always good together, right?" He shot a quick glance at me, his eyes full of embarrassment. "Right. Melanie," he continued, anxious to change the subject, "is my model for my new project." "Oh, yes, I can see why," she said, turning back to me. "She's so pretty." "She must make a wonderful model, Kenneth." "She's doing a terrific job," he said, looking at me. I smiled, enjoying my moment in the sunshine. "Good," Holly said. "It's so beautiful here, so conducive to art, to inner expression. There's positive energy here, I feel it," she said, closing her eyes and embracing herself. She took a deep breath. I looked at Kenneth, and he smiled as we both waited. She popped her eyes open and gazed into my face with such intensity I nearly laughed. The first time I drove up here, I knew Kenneth had felt energy. "Remember, Kenneth? Remember how we just sat for hours and hours holding hands, soaking up the twilight and feeling the vibrations?" "Yes, Holly," he said in a tired voice. "Why don't I help you with your things?" "Oh, yes. It's so wonderful to be here again. You don't know how something like this can recharge your batteries, Melanie." "Melanie, until you're away in the world of chaos, drowning in tension." "I think she has some idea," Kenneth said with inscrutable smile of his. Holly turned back to me. "Oh, I can't wait to get to know you, Melanie. Kenneth has told me so much. You're like his little secret," she said. I glanced at him, wondering what that meant, delighted that he'd even mentioned me to Holly. That meant I was important to him. But then, why had he invited her here? Who is she? He hasn't told me anything about you," I said. "You must be his other little secret." Holly laughed, and for the first time I saw Kenneth Childs blush deeply. Your things? Kenneth reminded her firmly. Oh yes, my things. She uttered another musical laugh and went to the trunk of her car. It was stuffed with a small, battered suitcase. Let's just take these in for now, she said, pulling out the two largest. Kenneth took them in and started toward the house. She opened the rear door of the car and something rolled out. It looked like a large, clear stone. The back seat was filled with clothes, books, art supplies, and a lamp laid on the floor. Can you take this in for me, Melanie? She said, lifting the stone object. I'll get the other things. What is it? My crystal, she said. The energy is drawn to it, and then I draw it into myself. I never go anywhere without putting it alongside my bed. Kenneth doesn't mind, she said. Excuse me? Oh, you'll see. We have so much to tell each other, she declared. How long are you staying here? I asked. She paused and gazed around in a moment, took a deep breath, and then nodded, before closing and opening her eyes. Until I stop hearing it, she said. Hearing it? Hearing what? The voice that called me here, she smiled. You'll understand, I promise, she said, and reached down to pick up a packet of incense off the floor in the back of the car. She closed the door and we started toward the house. I only know a little about Kenneth's new work, but from the way he talks, I can see it's the most exciting thing he's done in years. I'm glad he found it. He was beginning to worry me, she said with a serious face, her eyes darker and her lips tighter. I was beginning to think that the shadows of the past were overtaking his bright light and dimming his spirit. I'm so happy for him, and if you had anything to do with it, I'm grateful to you, she added. I just looked at her, failing to find the words to respond to all this. I turned to carry her crystal to the guest room, and she stopped me. Not that way, dear, I told you, she said. That has to be beside my bed. She nodded towards Kenneth's bedroom and smiled. I hesitated, my chest feeling hollow. No heartbeat, no blood, no lungs, just an echo chamber full of surprise and disappointment. Kenneth appeared at the bedroom door. I put your suitcases by the closet. Anything else you want brought in right now? No, Ken, thanks. Okay, I'm going back to the studio. He turned to me. Are you sure that you don't mind staying the whole day? I think I'm getting a little stomachache, but I'll be fine. I can stay, I said. Oh? Stomachache? Don't you worry, Ken. I'll help her. I have just the herbal medicine for stomachaches. Come along, Melanie, she sang. Reluctantly, my legs feeling like twin sticks of lead, I followed her into Kenneth's bedroom. She took the crystal and placed it beside the bed on the nightstand, and then she turned to me and smiled. Time of the month, she asked. What? Oh, no, I said. Did you eat something nasty this morning? No. Just stressed then, she concluded. I have just what you need. I doubt it, I said harshly. She stared at me curiously. You have a lot of negative energy coming out of you, Melanie. If you let me, I'll help you. No, thank you, I said. I'll just walk it off. That usually works. I turned and fled from the bedroom. Outside, I hesitated, not sure if I wanted to walk home or walk on the beach. Why hadn't he told me she was coming? Why hadn't he told me anything about her? Is every man a liar? I shouted at the sea. And it sounded back to what sounded like a resounding yes to me. Just when I had gotten to the point where I thought I knew Kenneth, I discovered he was more of a stranger than ever. Perhaps we'll never get to know anyone, I thought. Not even people we love or who claim that love us. I took a deep breath and walked toward the sea, hoping that the roar of the waves I heard would grow louder and louder and drown the angry voices chattering inside me.